Welcome to the HR Think Tank, our podcast that uncovers the power a trusted workforce has on team performance, culture, and morale. We gather insights from experts, business leaders, and HR professionals to help you lead your team more effectively. Here's your host, Kai No, CEO of Verify Now, a trusted provider of background screening services.
Healthy relationships are a cornerstone of a happy life. They're also a key foundation for a successful business. In this episode, we discuss how leaders can support positive workplace relationships and employee wellbeing. Our guest today is Elisabeth Shaw, the CEO of Relationships Australia New South Wales, a leading provider of relationship support services for individuals, families, and communities. Elisabeth has extensive experience in relationship services, executive coaching to not-for-profit and public sector leaders, and professional ethics consulting to industry bodies. She has taught in master's programs at ACU, NSW and Newcastle universities, and is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society, who acknowledged her in 2019 with an award for distinguished contributions to professional psychology. Welcome to the show, Elisabeth.
Hi.
So you've got extensive experience in relationship services, in professional ethics, and as a leader. I'm interested in how that relationship crosses over between counselling sphere and the management sphere. Are there any skills or frameworks that are used in your family relationship work that have value in the management or leadership environment?
Look, absolutely. I find all that I am and all that I've trained in, I bring to bear in whatever I do next. And so I think it's really important that I integrate those skills well and deliver them in a way, though, that's appropriate to the business environment. And I think that's the trick in it, because if you are trained as a practitioner, as I am, then if you started to use counselling techniques or started to delve into your employees' private lives, or you went too far in conversations, that would be problematic in a whole lot of ways. And unfortunately, there are not-for-profits, sort of old school, certainly when I first trained, that might have really overused those skills. For me, it's trying to get that balance between what I know about people and how to be business-minded, and how to come from a place of integrating those in the best possible way.
So on this podcast, we like to explore our guests' leadership journey. And if you don't mind me asking, how was that transition for you, going from a practitioner to then becoming a leader of this large not-for-profit?
Well, in terms of literally how I did my career jumps, a lot of it was fairly accidental. And I don't know that I set out with a plan. It was that I literally was sort of on the spot, and I was invited or directed by people around at the time to say, oh, look, so-and-so's left. We think you should do that job now. So there was a bit of that. And I made a few career jumps quite quickly as a result of those opportunities, shall we call them. At the time, I felt like I was often floundering, so I had to sort of fake it till I made it. And I am a very voracious learner, so I rushed off and did further qualifications in any number of things, thinking that would make me feel more competent, and sometimes that really helped. Sometimes it was, as they say, book knowledge, and I still needed to work out how to apply it in a skillful way. So I think I was running behind roles for quite a long time and scrabbling to catch up. And I think I didn't always have the mentors that I would have liked, which can be just so critical. If you've got a wise guide to look up to, it's such a gift. And in those early years, sometimes that wasn't always in place, but I found my feet with it. And once I realised that I shouldn't wait for that to come along, but to seek it, I did much better. I think the other thing that was lucky for me is that family therapy, which was my initial counselling training, is based on systems theory. And systems theory, it's biological systems theory, but broadly the same philosophy underpins a lot of management theory. And so fundamentally for me, it's always about how do groups live and work well together. And what is it about the sum being greater than the individual parts, as they say, that is the same thinking, but on a different scale, because still the principles of cooperation and being open to influence and wanting to be a good person in relationship and managing conflict and managing communication, they're all the same themes. Yeah. It's helpful in that way.
Great. And so you've done a lot of work in the professional ethics field. Could you please talk a little bit about what this means and how this connects to the question of relationship management in the workplace?
Yeah, look, this was a very interesting career development for me in that I had done a master's degree in management, which was the thing that I rushed off and did when I got into management. And I was around conversations about the importance of ethics and ethical leadership, but it was talked about, but we never went into it in any detail. So I kept thinking, well, that's what I need to be hanging on to. But I didn't really know what it meant in practice. So I found another degree. Yeah. And so this was a unique degree at New South Wales University on professional ethics. And I found a great love and a great passion because professional ethics, as the degree was, founded in moral philosophy, just opened up a vista of understanding about how we can kind of get our heads on straight, how we can work out our own values, come from a place of integrity. I did a lot of reading about different philosophers. Of course, that always helps. But there were really good intersections between moral philosophy and moral psychology. So there was a nice bridge that I could build and a literature trail, even in psychology, I could go off and explore. And what I found is that this was, again, a very malleable skill set. So lots of opportunities came from that because it was an unusual degree and it took 2 years to do it. As I talked about this interesting thing I was doing, suddenly I became the sort of token ethics person that could be wheeled out for the guest lecture on this or the ethics committee on that, or I could write a code of ethics. I'm not sure I could always do all of those things, but I gratefully said yes in order to keep exploring the development of the ideas, and I got involved with the Ethics Centre, and again that took me in some directions around consulting and services with them, which continues to be a very rich experience. So what I found is that as another strand of how I think about myself in leadership and what I want for my organisations and my teams, it became a set of principles by which I could live because organisational rules and policies and procedures are really very limited in their application. Generally, who you are in the world and how you want to be with others, getting that sorted is a much better skill set, but it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. And is that something your employees, your direct reports know about you from day one when they join the organisation, that they know you've got this professional ethics background and that, I guess, that's woven into your leadership and management style?
Look, I would hope it's really visible and everyone knows full well about it. I hope I do it well. They certainly know of my interests, absolutely. And there are certain ways I think it does show itself. There are certain ways in which I think or approach problem solving where it would be very evident and certain things that I hold dear that I do talk about. And so certainly I think it would be obvious to people. I sometimes wonder if I could make more of it, but I do encourage it for others as well.
Yeah, great. So speaking of managing boundaries, this is something I guess has been really topical, particularly with workplaces becoming more flexible, home becoming the place of work, hybrid models. So this is in the context of managing relationships and the boundaries around it. So the example here is, what if you've got an employee who's an oversharer in ways that makes others uncomfortable, or an employee who's excessively interested in other employees? I haven't given you the full context around it, but have you got some tips around how employees can manage these boundaries in the workplace?
What I often talk to people about is, again, coming back to good principles. And so often we will say that our behaviour is only motivated by good. And there's research on this, that we tend to dress up our own behaviour as inherently good and our intentions were only ever very noble. And so someone who's excessively curious can say, I'm just really interested in people, and isn't that a compliment? compliment to them that it's so lovely. And so I guess it's trying to help people see the flip side about that it's things are not necessarily inherently good, that they can have a downside and they often need to be negotiated. I think people who are oversharing, sometimes I'll talk to them about really wanting to protect their interests, and that giving too much away may not be always in their interest. Like any form of exposure, sometimes you've given material away that you wish you hadn't, or others can't be trusted with who you are. So I'll often talk to people about whether they could protect themselves better rather than clamp down that they're doing the wrong thing, but maybe talk to them about from a position of respect of this not always being perhaps in their interest to do this.
Yeah, because I guess when particularly for people who are new to a team, people often say a good way to build trust is disclosure.
Yes.
Right? But if you, an employee who doesn't have the sense of what oversharing is, because maybe, in that team culture, the sharing is at this level.
Yes.
And so the person's overstepped the mark. They need to know when they've overstepped that mark. And I think the way that you've put it is really helpful. You're talking about it more in their lens, about that protection. Now, what about for individuals who, are curious? Are you saying you would address that with that individual rather than the individual that they're curious about? Or what's the approach to handle that boundary with an employee who
who's maybe asking too many questions of others, that sort of thing.
Like on a personal level too. So, we're not even talking about a work thing.
Yeah. Look, I suppose, another thing that I tend to look at is trying to encourage teams and individuals to give feedback in the moment. And that's what we're often not good at. And so you'll often have employees escalate it, say to someone like me and say, look, I don't want to make a complaint and I don't want to, to do anything about it, but just that I'd let you know that person's really annoying everybody else, and they just sort of leave you with it. So often if it's happening directly to me, then I can give that feedback. But sometimes you hear that someone's developed a reputation, and the reason people develop a reputation is because they're surrounded by conflict avoidant people who never tell them that they've overstepped. So, of course, they keep blundering along in life, as we all do, having no idea that they're crossing boundaries. And the worry for me is that people can often feel very shamed because when they finally find out, they can feel very exposed, because it's often someone does become very reactive and kind of lets them have it. And then they'll say, everybody here thinks this about you, and that can be incredibly shaming. And I guess that's what often disappoints me about performance management, is that a very small tip done with kindness, most of us would self-correct, unless you've got no self-awareness, and of course there are people like that. Then people will correct. But you often see these characters who've gotten larger than life in an organisation because they're surrounded by people who don't want to tackle them.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, which leads me on to the next question. Which I just want to talk about this article that I read from the Harvard Business Review around managing a polarised workforce. And so one of the points that they make is leaders that actively avoid disagreement in the workplace or seek compromise to make it disappear, well, employees actually follow suit because they're seeing this is what their managers do, this is what the leaders do, and it can have a negative impact on not only collaboration but innovation. So they offer 4 high-level strategies, and I'd love to get your view on this, but they offer 4 high-level strategies to achieve the goal of true collaboration that empowers people to deal with opposing views. So first one is diffuse fears of disagreeing with others. Second is to teach people to be open-minded. 3 is to pick your words carefully. And then 4 is to foster a culture that encourages tolerance. So I'd love to get your view on that. And if you could provide any sort of practical aspects of making this strategy, high-level strategy, a reality.
Look, it's true enough that more people are conflict avoidant. And if you've got a history of or maybe in your own family or other workplaces with bullying, for example, people bring their own terror of poorly managed relationships into the workplace. And so some people clamp down on any sort of slight escalation in the room as if, oh no, there's going to be trouble, and the team will fall apart. And I mean, even in my own counselling tradition of couple and family therapy that, for many years, probably even prior to my generation, this sort of arguments are inherently bad, and a couple that argues, that would be a terrible thing. Whereas, of course, arguments can be full of growth and full of opportunity and clarity. It's how you argue.
Yes.
How you argue could be the death knell, but the arguing per se is perfectly fine. And it's the same in the workplace. It's really the art form of how do we argue, and is everyone left standing at the end? And that's the the playing the issue, not the person, which is important. It's very difficult to get cut through, because I've also had people come in and run sessions on courageous conversations and how to give feedback. And, we're in a helping organisation full of skills. And still, in terms of fellow employees, people don't want to speak up, don't want to take others on. It's really a compelling thing that I'd rather say nothing and then go up to my colleague and complain about somebody else than speak to them directly. So for me, I think the bigger problem is how to get people to speak up with confidence and with respect, or to speak up at all sometimes, than it is a fear that fights will break out, because in reality, it's not common that they do.
Yeah, it's true. And I think it's getting past that point of discomfort. And in life, sometimes you need a bit of discomfort to grow.
That's true.
But it's also, when you have disagreements, like you said, focus on the issue at hand rather than the person. Right. So this is particularly important when it comes to project-based work, because if you have no one that debates with rigor around the process that we're about to undertake and invest $10 million, we could end up with a lemon of a project, and it could have been avoided, had we had that discussion. So I think it's important to have that training and that encouragement from the leaders early, that it's okay to have this and focus on the issue. But if you do have disagreements that, might go a little bit over the top, it's also about how we then heal afterwards, right? Because if we heal in the right way, whatever that is for that team, we could actually be stronger after this experience.
Look, that's right. And I guess just one other thing that I'll just say I think the fear of it getting out of hand is, for me, generally related to a performance management issue that hasn't been managed. Conflict can go badly wrong. It's often driven by one or two people who should have been managed around their behaviour. And so they'll dominate the group, they'll take over. And so the fear of it going awry is managing bullies in the room or managing people who are unregulated. Or, I've seen people who just cry really quickly, and then that's a death knell of a conversation too. So I think a lot of that is actually about managing individuals, and sometimes the leadership doesn't do that, starts doing too much training for the group. Let's all have a PD on a professional development event on good communication, instead of going up to, Bob and saying, Bob, you're out of line. I think that's also something important. The other thing about accountability, to your point about healing and repair, you're absolutely right that if there is recovery, it takes the sting out of what's happened. So even if something didn't go well, if it's effectively repaired, then there's still learning in it. How to effectively repair things is, though, an art form in itself. And, I think when we had recent events at Parliament House, there was a lot of discussion about apologies, and I did quite a lot of sort of public comment on this. I was amazed how skills about how to give a good apology are not necessarily well known. Sometimes saying things like, I'm really sorry you're upset. I'm sorry that, you're very sensitive, aren't you? Or I'm sorry you took it that way. Or it could be that wasn't my intention. All of those things either make it your problem, or it wasn't my intention is like, I'm a good person, really. Whereas, a good apology is, I said the wrong thing and I really affected you, and I'm sorry for that. It's an I. I actively did something.
You own your actions.
Well, that's right. And if you do that and you're solid around that, that's a very powerful thing to do. Yeah,
because on this podcast, our primary driver is to explore how a trusted workforce has an impact on, performance, culture, and morale. Right? Our belief is a trusted workforce is better for everyone, for the employers and the employees. And just wrapping up that point that we had about this article, there was a section after they provided these tips which said, a longitudinal study found that high-performing teams had relatively low levels of personal conflict and high levels of disagreement about how they do their work. They also had high levels of trust and respect and engaged in open discussions about possible approaches to their tasks. So that's really fascinating because I think it's about separating that task and that personal issue, because the lines are blurry. Like when you're in the heat of the moment, because some people might, fix their idea that they just had to their own personal value. And so when someone says that's not a great idea, they could be receiving it as, well, you don't think I'm of great value. And it's about separating those two conversations, right?
And that comes back to, again, sometimes the values in the team. So this, often comes back for me as what you end up holding onto at the core of this is whether you've got mutual respect and you've got trust, because then and also if you can talk up and even maybe laugh about the differences to say, oh, look, me, the psychologist, I'm going to say this. It's still holding my ground. It's not, so I think the way that you can talk about this group's come together because you're different and we're counting on you being different and we celebrate the differences. But I think it often goes underground and it comes out in a way that is less helpful. The other things we have to think about if we're going to embrace diversity of thinking is whether cultural differences are going to have an impact too, and if there's hierarchy in the room. So we can't be naive about all the different factors swirling around that will make it possible to speak or not speak. And the model the leader is offering around difference, are they willing to be tackled in front of other people? All of those sorts of things will make a difference as to whether you can elevate to this standard or not.
That's why we're big supporters of, having psychological safety across the organisation, so the feedback can come from any direction, because it shouldn't be one direction only, because then you'll have a workforce that will never provide feedback upwards because they're scared that something bad will happen to them.
That's right. I think the trouble is it's well talked about that we need this thing called psychological safety. But unless you really understand what it means and you know how to get there, it can very quickly become conflated with conflict avoidance.
Yes.
Because, and unfortunately, in the people and culture space, we can sometimes see people escalate a disagreement into a claim of bullying. Of course, it doesn't happen often and it's, but, and it happens for a whole lot of reasons. But I think as we're coming to grips with some of these things, that we need to stamp out bullying and we do need psychological safety, that we see the terms applied in simplistic ways and without nuance and without proper training. And then they can get bandied around in a way that becomes confusing as well. And so being safe doesn't mean we only ever say the safe thing. For example, sometimes we might say very disruptive things and very provocative things, but if it comes from a place of respect and good intention, you can do that. And that's why, again, it comes back to the principles of what is it that's driving your speech. And because if it does come from a good place, you can probably get away with it.
And I think this is why, as part of the recruitment process, if you've done your work and it's a thorough process and you've hired the right person and they're there for their views, you value them, you value their time, you value their experience, you're going to give them that space to provide those different opinions. Because if you're not, they'll be thinking, I'm not really valued here. I can't even speak up. It's very hard for me to do my job. So in the workplace, obviously there'll be disagreements, things happen, interpersonal conflict, interpersonal issues. And sometimes as a manager or a leader, you end up being the counsellor for the group of employees. So I just want to know a little bit more about this service that Relationships Australia offers, and it's called the Accidental Counsellor Workshop. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and what are the benefits of this workshop for supervisors, for managers, for employees?
What I think is really valuable about it is an acknowledgement that there's a lot of different people in organisations who do become an accidental counsellor. You might be the colleague at the next desk who is just the incessant debriefer of something that's happened. You might be in people and culture. You might be a line manager, and you find yourself in this position. And it is an art form to be both a good listener and a kind person, but also know the limits of it and not to get co-opted in a role that you really don't want to play. So I think there's something about having enough skill to be of use and not so many skills that you keep going with it. And I think that's really important. And there are examples. For example, you have a colleague who's really struggling with their mental health, and it's pretty obvious to everyone, and they've decided they're going to confide in you.
Yeah.
And they talk to you daily about where they're up to and the misery of what's happening at home and so on, and you really are worried for them. You're worried they're not travelling well at all. But when you say, have you thought about getting professional help, they say, look, it's just so lovely talking to you each day. If I can just do that each day, that's pretty good for me.
Yeah.
Now, that sort of thing is very problematic, but you can feel very pinned. Like it's hard when someone's struggling to say, look, I can't be that person and it's now affecting me. Yeah. Or, I'm really not the best person. I don't have the skills. Yeah. It can be very hard to serve it back to them when you're already in the role. So I think it's quite a healthy thing for a workplace to roll out, at least for all the key people that are most likely to be implicated in this, to give the skills and also the permission to set the boundaries and to know when it's okay to say, look, I can't be that for you. I'm not in a good place myself, or I'm not well placed to do that, or I'm not skilled, whatever it might be. But I think you often need permission to say no. So it is a program that we do run in workplaces, and whether it is that you're an ambulance driver and you happen to be with a colleague all the time, or there's all sorts of moments where you are caught by accident in the role of confidant. Yeah,
it's true. And I think we were talking about workplace boundaries. I mean, that's there and it helps establish some of those guidelines, because if it's your first role in the job as well, sometimes you could be disclosing more than what you might want in a professional setting.
That's right.
Speaking of accidental counsellors, Relationships Australia provides counselling services. And they're professional counsellors, not accidental ones. So I imagine, the service that you provide and the type of work it can be quite emotionally demanding for your employees. I'm interested to learn how you, as a leader, support the staff wellbeing.
There's some things that we very actively do. For example, the things that, any good organisation does, that we have an employee assistance program. We do run a lot of professional training around all sorts of things, both compliance related and also nourishment for people to get ideas and feel like they're growing in their roles, which is a good protective factor. We also offer a lot of clinical supervision. So it's supervision is a funny term. I think outside our industry, it always looks like, why do you need supervision? But it's not in the trainee kind of space, but it is about clinical consultation, really. So people every fortnight have someone to speak to about their caseload and anyone who's worrying them, and you can access that all the time as needed, but you have very formal meetings that are always in place. So I think a lot of that professional routine is critical, and also a lot of work on high functioning teams, just because people get a lot of support by a good team, trying to celebrate the successes. All of those things are morale boosts. And so I think all of those things are a good professional routine. The thing about our work, and it's the biggest risk in helping services and in public services such as hospitals, is the risk of vicarious trauma. So this is widely talked about, and in terms of insurance, this is one of the things that you have to look at. But equally, there is a phenomena called vicarious resilience. And this is because the stories that we hear and the change process that we're engaged in is just an extraordinarily hopeful experience, that people come in with the hope that we'll help them, and we do our best to help them. And as we see people change, that's incredibly bolstering. So often people will ask me, how have you done that? all your career, as if it's just a terrible drain. And again, that's because to others hearing stories, they'd panic or be overwhelmed or flooded or terrified. Whereas for me, I'm thinking, how can we get out of this? What can I offer?
Yeah.
How can I see this change? It's a really exciting, encouraging, hopeful process. And as you see people work their problems through, I can't think of anything that's better than that.
It's a great celebration.
It is a celebration. And so there's a lot of nourishment that comes in the work that is never really talked about, but is part of the journey.
Yeah, and something that you mentioned earlier, you talked about the concept of punctuation of time. What other, let's talk about that, but are there any other concepts that you've enacted in your workplaces that have helped with employee wellbeing?
Look, I do think remembering that a lot of people do benefit from professional nourishment. I think making sure your workplace is an interesting place to be so that even if you feel a bit flat, professionals tend to like the ideas of their profession. So if they've got events coming up, either they've booked into them or we've provided them, where it's a day to both work with their colleagues but on some new concepts, they go back to the work with a few new ideas. That in itself makes the workplace a bit exciting, and it makes them feel proud that this is a workplace that is a thought leader and we are trying to develop. We present research back to them. We present this is what our clients tell us about what they achieved, and even our back office supports feel very thrilled by that. We also have an all-staff showcase every 18 months, and where all the staff get together and we have individual teams present their best work to each other.
Wow.
And that's enormously thrilling.
Yeah.
It's the most heartwarming injection, and people walk away and talk about that for months. So I think those moments of celebration are important, but our staff surveys just always tell us the value of the local teams too, that you can do all staff events, but ultimately the quality of the local team and who they sit with is going to be why people stay with you a lot of the time, because they're so dependent on each other. Yeah. It has to be a good experience.
Yeah, look, you go in for the job and, obviously remuneration plays its role, but you really stick for the team. And if you've grown with the team and you feel supported and you celebrate these milestones, and you see a lot of workplace relationships, even when people leave, they're still friends. They're still friends afterwards.
That's a joy, and it's an incidental benefit. You don't walk into a workplace hoping to find best friends, but you can. Yeah. You can find your partner there. There's about 35% of people, I think, meet their partner at work. So there's lots of, not that you'd plan it to be a dating.
That's not your intention to get the job.
It's not your intention, but it could be a good benefit. The other thing I should say that we never did because of the nature of we're a very face-to-face heavy organisation. Where the pandemic really helped us move out of traditional modes for these terrible reasons is to move everything online. So for us, that was like a revolution in our kind of industry. So the other thing that we do is we have all-staff town halls, which a lot of organisations do, but that's a very unusual thing for us to do. So we've been doing those for 2 years and they've been remarkably successful, and staff have been excited about these different little ways we can come together, whereas when I first started as a leader, if I'd said we're going to do something online, people would be horrified. They couldn't work out how to book in. They couldn't, and so that's quite thrilling that you can connect with everybody in a very traditional workplace in new ways.
Yeah, because I was going to ask that exact question. Like we talk about these celebration, and when you think about the traditional office sense, it's very easy because you're all there, right? You can feel the energy, the room's decorated, there's food. But what are some additional considerations for hybrid or remote teams that you've got to take into place? Because the feeling's not the same. It may not be the same. Have you got any advice for employees out there who have these teams? How can they celebrate it?
Look, I think it is important not to minimise the toll that it can take. So I have known of organisations that are so busy saying everything's fine that there's no way to talk about it not being fine. And in fact, most people, if they just have a space to talk about how tough it is, can let those feelings go. So I think being able to say every now and then, look, how's everyone going with entirely online, and where does it work for you and where doesn't it? I think that's just healthy. Again, we shouldn't suppress the negative. This is the whole thing. So you don't want to spend the whole session complaining, and particularly, and this is where, you know, with a lack of skill, you can just panic. Oh no, they're saying they're not enjoying it. What am I going to do? I can't stop it. To just remember that just listening and hearing, yes, it is tough. How do we get through it? What do you try? What do you try? You can problem solve together and make it a positive conversation. And so I think that fear of the negative means that it's not expressible. I think some people their jobs are turning into online jobs, and we're still in the first flush of talking up the benefits. You know, you can chat to the dog and you can hang out a load of washing in between and all of those things. But therefore, we're not really coming to grips with the longer term issues with this. And if you are more of an extrovert, then your social needs probably won't be met, because it's not a replacement to just be online. I think a lot of the research we're seeing, which is about that singular focus on someone, is not only very, very tiring for the brain, but it does mess with your memory. There's lots of things about it that lack depth and texture because people are so sick of it. They don't want to chat. You know, the early days of let's have drinks online at Friday, you know, just people are just, I would just so rather hang up on you and go and sit in the backyard. So I think we've got to be very careful where it becomes a very sort of domesticised arrangement. And I think the reality is if people's needs aren't being met, then they turn their attention to who else is in the household and they try and milk what they need out of that group. And usually domestic relationships work well by engagement outside of the house. So if you suddenly demand more from your domestic circumstances, you know, that's where relationships, intimate relationships, are struggling as well, because there's just too much loaded on them.
A lot of time. And
that's
you
right.
know, for people like me, I'm extroverted. I'm like I'm like a social vampire. I need to be around people because that refuels me, that allows me to think more clearly, that makes me feel motivated. And working from home just completely is tough. I mean, lockdown was tough for all of us, right? But the reason why I want to raise this is because Relationships Australia has put together this great tip sheet on dealing with loneliness, and certainly with the remote working arrangements that some people have, they've got a disconnection with their colleagues. You know, I caught up with some friends recently who said they've not really met their colleagues, and without the incidental coffee run-ins or the office chats, they don't really feel this strong connection with their team, and therefore they lack that strong connection to the mission of the company as well. So if you could talk to us a little bit more about this project and, you know, what the impacts of loneliness through isolation over the last couple of years has been for many of us.
Yeah, look, I think there's just so many aspects to relating well that are invisible to us, because we would never have necessarily valued the corridor conversations or the running into someone in the bathroom, you know, where you could just say something and walk out and say, thank goodness I ran into that person because that was the bit that I needed, or you're at the photocopier together. So there's an awful lot of incidental interaction, or the walking over for the coffee. And someone who's sometimes annoying to you, you find yourself walking back from coffee and having a chat about their family, and you think, oh, look, you're a decent person. And, you know, we all love our kids. And so I think those incidental interactions are gold in that they ease the scratchy moments.
So, look, in terms of the loneliness, do you think we can recreate, or what are the alternatives for those incidental moments? If you've got any advice on that, that would be great.
Look, I think what's really important is to spend some time owning who you actually are, like really thinking about, why does this bug me, or why am I feeling deprived or lonely or cut off, and to really say, what are my needs are not being met. Whereas often we can be drawn into the other, like rail against the company, rail against our colleagues, this is all so substandard. Whereas I think if you could say, what of the conflict, what does it say about me? And maybe I need more than this. Maybe what I need from my colleagues isn't on offer, or maybe this job isn't really the arrangement that's going to suit me, and everyone tells me I should be enjoying it and the company says it's a great job, but I just am not feeling it. And so I think it's sometimes important to own that, or to say, for me to thrive in this role, I'm going to need to get my needs met, and my needs are A, B and C, and I need a plan about that, an active plan about that. And sometimes we don't get into that. It's very easy to be lulled into the next deadline and the company wants this and everybody else seems to be managing and no one else is complaining, and maybe if I just get this next deadline met, I'll feel better. But what we don't do is put ourselves in the equation as an active agent. And if you are in an online job, yes, some of your needs might be met if you have a fair number of interactions with others. And that's what I find is some people say, I'm fine because I'm on Zoom all day. Other people are not at all fine because they're on Zoom all day. But to just remember, it's not a full relationship, and that walking around the block and buying a coffee and saying hello to the barista might in fact be surprisingly meaningful. Normally you would ignore such an interaction. But I think to walk in and have someone say, oh, your usual flat white, you feel known, you feel visible, you feel like you belong in your community. So you say hello to other people with the dog. Those sort of moments are surprisingly important. And in fact, I found during lockdown making a deliberate decision to say good morning or whatever to whoever I ran into in the street, I just thought, we just need to say something to each other. And most people will reply or smile or get a bit of a surprise you've spoken to them. Those little moments help us remember that we matter and we are not just a cog in a wheel. And sitting at home at a desk, particularly doing a lot of transactional work, can make you feel very invisible.
And I think that's why it's important for colleagues and for managers to reach out. So if you've got things like, instant messaging, just a simple hello, how's it going? For me, I'm a bit of a phone person. So I actually like it when people call me out of the blue and say, how's it going? Because I do the same, to check in on family and friends. Bit different with my mum. My mum doesn't know how to text, so she calls me for everything that you would normally text for. But otherwise, I think taking that initiative in your workplace, in your team, to just check in on people and just have that curiosity to say, hey, how's it going? Are you okay? And also, am I okay? I think that's lovely.
Look, I think that's just on that. It's a great point, and I think it's really worth underlining that it's good to pick the unusual way of communicating, because if you're on Zoom all day or you're on some sort of chat and it's a chat even about something nice, it's another thing to reply to. Whereas if you're on Zoom all day and you get a phone call, that can be, it feels very human and very different. And I've had too many people who are so under siege with their computer that they'll say to me, oh, I've emailed that person 4 times and they're not replying. And I've said, have you thought of ringing them up? And no, I hadn't thought of that. It's almost like something's really happened that we've got so attached to one device.
It's more efficient, that's why.
Sometimes thinking, I want to check on that person, what would be the way to show I really do care? It would be not adding to their email trail.
That's a really lovely thought. One last thing I'll say on this is I really cherish the face-to-face experiences that I have with my colleagues, and often when we do catch up, it'll be over food or drinks or something where there's some sort of consumption, because I love having that experience. I love having a good time, and for me, that's how I think of work. Like I like to have a good time at work, even if it's challenging from a task perspective or a project perspective. I still want to enjoy it.
And it's critical, and that human contact is absolutely critical to round out all the other aspects of a relationship that otherwise can become very thin. It's a very thin relationship based on very, very limited information. And, given that there is research that it messes with our memory, you've probably had the experience where you meet someone and they say they've met you online. You don't even remember them because they were just a little tiny face
so many
in the 40 other things you've done this week. People don't matter in that way or stand out. And that's really a terrible thing to say, isn't it?
It is. No, because, people are different. Speaking of caring for people and reaching out, we've touched on this a little bit, but I just want to ask the question, how far is too far when it comes to caring for your team in a work context? How do you keep an awareness and interest in your employees' well-being without overstepping the professional boundaries?
Look, it is very important that we hold team care as a mutual task. It's good for everyone involved to do that. So I think managers who've decided it's their job, that they're going to be the social glue or they're going to be the kind of de facto counsellor, tends to go pear-shaped in all sorts of ways, because sometimes you do invite employee confidences, or you even can look like you've got favourites. It's much better to talk it up as a shared responsibility, and it is really important that you remember that you also have a duty to help people protect their own privacy. And sometimes over-disclosing at work or confiding in you, it ties your hands, but it also can sabotage their career. If they're talking about their divorce and they've taken up drinking, and sorry, I was late, I slept in because I'm drinking so much. As a manager, you might be sympathetic in the moment, but you might think, oh, I've got this promotion coming up, I won't be giving it to you. So it's actually, you might think it's a kindness in the moment, but it's actually an unkindness to them to invite it or to encourage it. So sometimes I might even say to someone, look, thanks for telling me what's going on for you. Is it okay if I just check in with you from time to time? But it's fine for you to not talk any further about it. You've given me the heads up. And then I mostly relate to them in a normal way. And every so often I might say, look, how are you? But I don't say, how's that situation with your mother going? Because I don't want to assume or set a tone that I expect an update or that I'm on for that type of conversation all the time. I mean, I hope that I'm approachable, but I worry for people. I've heard too often that material's been given and it ends up being misused. It's a kindness in the moment that gets messed with down the track and doesn't serve anyone's interests.
Great advice. So this is one of the last questions around employee well-being. How can prioritising employee well-being and happiness contribute to staff retention and the attraction of new hires?
Look, it is critical because you then, if you have feedback and it's definite feedback that your workplace is in that kind of good shape, to be able to say, even in an interview, this is what we can offer and we've got evidence it's true, our staff engagement surveys show this, and you know that they're going to land in a team that will be talking like that, that's incredibly positive. It is about saying, how do we create that together, and making sure everyone has a part to play in that. I know I'm emphasising that a lot, but I do think it can be talked about as if something that management should have provided, and you're doomed if you think that. I mean, I would fail in my task. So if, I would be looking at what does it actually mean to have that kind of joy in the workplace, because everyone might define it differently. For some people, the joy is being able to finish at 5 and go straight home with no other job to do. For others, it might be something more about a celebratory workplace or lunches together, and others might say that's definitely not what I want to be doing. I'd rather go home to my own people. So I think you've got to work it out, and as the team changes, to remember that new people will bring new ideas about workplace joy. And it is different to social, how you define it socially outside the workplace.
And thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to give that shout out because, we saw that Relationships Australia New South Wales was awarded last year for the AFR award for Best Place to Work. So I can certainly see that in how you view things and the tips that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for coming on the show today and having a chat. Before we wrap up, we like to do the Fast Five. It's 5 questions that we ask just to get to know you a little bit better. Are you okay if we get started? What was your first job and why did you get it?
My first job was as a waitress, and it was the job that you could get in my local community. And I think, young people often hand the job to the next young person that they know.
What's something interesting that's not on your CV?
And I think it's probably tricky because I've had the great pleasure of finding great joy in my profession. And so a lot of my professional interests, a lot of my interests outside of work are still in my fields of work. I know other professionals that do this where it's like a vocation. So there's a lot on my CV that is about who I am. It is about my identity overall. Who I am, that it's not on my CV is, of course, my family life and my friends who, without them I'd be nothing. So they're equally important. They wouldn't go on a CV. But it's true enough that I have a big work life, and I stand for that, and I feel so blessed to have had the career that I've had. And so it does portray a lot of my interests and the little trails that I followed.
You found great alignment between the two. What have you learned about leadership and working on a team that you would want to teach your younger self?
Oh, look, I think I was very defensive and over-responsible when I was younger, and to be able to say that a lot of what's needed at work is a joint enterprise. It was not up to me. Instead of feeling like a failure because I was the youngest person in my first team and I was the manager, and I was very brittle and just holding it all together and so busy trying to do the right thing. I think being able to relax and enjoy people and to know that most things work out in time. You know, what looks like an emergency now, give it 2 days and it's just gone away all by itself often. I wish I could have been more relaxed and enjoyed it rather than been such a stress head.
Can you provide a highlight from working in a trusted team?
Look, the highlight is that you can fail and make mistakes, and there can be real clangers, and you can get through that, and people forgive you and know that you're a work in progress. And look, if you've got people to look up to in your team, it's such a gift in life to be able to learn at the feet of good others. So I think that shared experience and the camaraderie that you can have in a trustworthy team is a great joy.
Yeah. Is there a particular experience or moment in time that you can recall to say, yeah, this is just that team, there's absolute trust everywhere? Is there a particular moment or experience that you can recall?
Yeah, look, I think certainly in terms of various leadership groups that I've been part of, there have been sweet spots within them where you've been together long enough and you've seen warts and all, and you've been through just enough ups and downs and survived it, that shared history makes you very strong. And sometimes then somebody leaves and someone new comes and you lose it for a little bit. You try and share the story of it, but you don't know if you're going to get there. So I think in any team that you've been in for any period of time, you come in and out of that in waves. And it is about the long haul. It's not about being disappointed when it shifts. It's about saying, well, this is the next version and we'll create something new again. Yeah,
it'll be different. Appreciate it for what you had.
Yeah.
What would you like your legacy to be?
Look, I am very driven to just make a difference to the public. You know, I have been in public service, in my view, all my life, and to try and make a difference in people's lives, individuals or teams. I do really try to help. You know, in the end, I might be the leader of a lot of these things, but I actually just want to be helpful to people. So if I can feel like I helped enough people and wasn't too much of a hindrance at the same time, then that would be a very satisfying life.
Elisabeth, thank you so much for coming on our show today.
Thanks. It's been a great conversation.
It's been it's been wonderful. Yeah. And, you know, my brain is like full of ideas and what you've said. Yeah, it's really great to hear how you see employee wellbeing. Today's guest was Elisabeth Shaw from Relationships Australia New South Wales, an organisation that's been supporting healthy Australian relationships for over 70 years. We got insight into the organisational relationships and wellbeing support that Elisabeth has implemented based on her learnings and experience from counselling, as well as relationships ethics and executive coaching. You can learn more about Relationships Australia's programs, including the Accidental Counsellor and the Loneliness Tip Sheet, via the links on the podcast episode show notes.
Thanks for listening to the HR Think Tank with Kai No. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share our podcast with your network. Check out the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode, or visit the Verify Now website for more information.